Oh, goody.
All right, what's going on, everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. So in this one, we're taking a look at some decks for the new location dropping tonight, the Sacred Timeline. Now, funny thing about this location, when it was data mined, it was actually very different and was actually kind of toxic. The text used to be, cards must be played here if possible, so another restrictive location. Luckily for us, it has since been changed, so that is actually not the location we're getting. The new version of this location is basically, if you fill this location, you're the first to fill this location, you get a copy of your starting hand. This is pretty neat. I think this is one of the more inventive locations we've got in a while, and I think it's going to be pretty fun to play with. So let's take a look at some decks designed for this location for the different pools in the game. Starting out with Pool 1. So Pool 1, unsurprisingly, a Zoo deck, and you're going to notice a trend throughout this video. The archetype that very much benefits the most from this location is going to be Zoo, because Zoo is the one deck in Marvel Snap where you're really just trying to dump your hand with your small things as fast as possible, so getting a essentially free reload of cards you already want to be playing and that are cheap that you can just throw out really quickly again seems very beneficial for the Zoo archetype. So first deck here, pretty standard Ka-Zar Zoo. There's really not that much to say about this. If you've played the game like at all in Pool 1, you've probably realized that Zoo is one of the best ways to go, and this location is going to make it even better. No crazy tech choices here, though. You might want to find room for an Electra, because there are going to be a lot of Zoo mirrors, but I don't think she's required, but could be useful potentially. So maybe try and find a spot for her here in place of one of the other 1-drops like Korg or Rocket, or maybe even one of the 3s. You could go even lower curve, because this really does benefit lower curve decks, so maybe drop Mr. Fantastic or Marvel, or Captain America, Marvel, or Electra. But other than that, very standard, very solid Zoo deck, and I think it is going to perform rather well for this location in Pool 1. Next up, we have our Pool 2 upgrades to the Zoo deck. Now, this is actually dubbed Cleanup Zoo, because this was popularized by a really good player, Cleanup, and shared a little bit recently by KM Best, one of the more popular Marvel Snap creators. A really good Zoo deck. So this plays, if you've played the Control Sarah deck before, this plays pretty similarly in style to that kind of deck, where we are a reactive deck trying to make some big swings with Shang-Chi and Enchantress towards the end of the game, but the rest of our deck is just a Zoo deck. It's just a standard Zoo deck. We do get some good upgrades in Pool 2 for Zoo with Sunspot and Iceman, very, very powerful early game cards. Other than that, pretty much standard stuff. Obviously, Shang-Chi makes his way into Pool 2 as well, and right now, Shang-Chi going to probably be the most popular tech card in the game because Zavu is still not nerfed yet, so a lot of big stuff going around, and will probably still be popular after the nerfs because of Shuri, and then still a lot of ongoing stuff around, so Enchantress definitely gets value there. Just gotta be a little careful not to accidentally Enchantress your own Ka-Zar, Blue Marvel, or Ant-Man. But really simple. I mean, the thing about these Zoo decks is to play them really, really optimally, it does take quite a bit of practice. And especially in Pool 2, you got to be much more mindful of Killmonger. You could throw an armor in here, but I think if you play around it carefully, it is possible to get away without having to run the armor. But for Pool 2 Zoo upgrades, this is what I would rock and should do pretty well with the new location. Next up, we have Devil Dinosaur, the other really good Pool 2 deck. This one is a little bit different than typical dinosaur lists because we want to have a bit lower to the ground curve so that we can get the benefit of the hot location and prevent our opponent from getting it as well. And obviously it benefits Dino, right? Because if it's giving us a copy of our starting hand, our hand will most likely be full or fuller even after dumping a bunch of cards on the field. So for this, we do have a few top-end cards here. Cosmo for some tech and protection, Moon Girl for double Dino stuff, and White Queen just because she's good with Dino and getting information, as well as Dino itself. But we do run a much lower curve, so we actually have 5 1-drops here. Ant-Man, Agent, Iceman, Korg, and Nightcrawler. Just some very, very good 1-drops. Just pretty much kind of stuff you want to be running if you're trying to fill up a location. 2-drops, we have Angela, Armor, and Sentinel. Just generically good 2-drops. You might find room for a Scorpion in there over one of these cards if that's your preference. But all pretty good cards, but it's pretty much your standard Dino deck. It's just curved a bit lower, so that way we're more likely to be able to take advantage of the new location. If you are interested in upgrading this deck past Pool 2, I really don't think you'd do a whole lot different. The only thing you'd pretty much do is you drop one of these 1-drops for a Quinjet. Quinjet is really, really good in Devil Dinosaur builds, and it's going to be even better with this location because it will reduce the cost of all the cards in your hand that didn't start there. So if you do get the location proc, you won't have to pay as much mana, and with all the 1-drops we have, there's a good chance a lot of those cards in your hand will actually be free, which is really, really good. Moving on into Pool 3 and above here, first deck is basically one that's not going to be trying to do something drastically different than what it normally does. And it's one that is on the chopping block, so Zabu getting changed pretty soon, so this deck will not function in its current form whenever those changes go live, but seems they're not coming today, so if you still want to make some use of Zabu before he gets changed, this is the deck I would use, and I think it's pretty reasonable into the new location. Obviously, this deck does not have a low curve, quite the opposite, but as long as you're kind of vigilant about retreating when things are bad, can do some really nutty stuff with Zabu, and by using the Zabu discount, there's a decent chance that we will be able to actually fill up the lane and get a copy of our starting hand, which most likely will have some 4-drops that get reduced by Zabu. So seems pretty decent. This is, in my opinion, one of the best decks in the game right now in the current meta until we get some changes. So seems pretty free to run it into the new location if you're looking to not necessarily build something super specific, but sometimes just take advantage of it with a deck that is normally powerful. The other Pool 3 deck here that I think is going to be a pretty good choice is Deathwave. So Deathwave usually has a pretty easy time filling up a lane, and it can also destroy it with Carnage or Deathlock or what have you. We have a decent amount of cheap stuff to actually fill the lane. It's possible you might even want to run a little bit more cheap stuff than usual, but this is just kind of the stock version I usually run, and it's one I'm going to be trying out with the location. I think it's going to be pretty reasonable. You get the added benefit of the effect without having to actually lock yourself out of that lane by the lane being too full, so that's pretty convenient. And Deathwave has had a bit of a resurgence since the buff of Wolverine, who seems a lot more appealing of a card now. It's been doing pretty decent, and I think it's going to be even better post-nerfs, but obviously we're still waiting for those. But seems like a good choice. So if you have the cards for it, Deathwave seems like a pretty sensible selection for this new location. We are running the She-Hulk version, but I don't think She-Hulk is required, though I do think she is one of the better versions. Magneto can be replaced with other 6-drops, or maybe just putting another low thing into your curve, and just rely on Death and She-Hulk for your big things. Definitely not required if you don't have him, but is pretty good if you do. Deathwave, good choice, would recommend it. The last 2 decks we're going to be taking a look at here are Thanos decks. So this is one card I think is going to be absolutely nuts with this location, and if you have him, you should be playing him. Just because we get so many more 1-drops, so we're going to be much more likely to be able to fill this location, and we have ways of getting rid of bad locations with Reality Stone, moving out of locations, even the featured one with the Move Stone. It's just there's so much this deck can do. Thanos has been putting up pretty decent results recently, and I think the Thanos decks are actually going to get a pretty big boost from the upcoming balance changes. But for this location, I think they are a super sweet choice if you have them. The first one here is a Thanos Zoo deck. Pretty standard stuff, very similar to the other Zoo decks I showed here. The few different additions we have, obviously Quinjet. Quinjet's really busted both with Thanos stones and the location, because free 1-drops are really good, it turns out. The other different inclusions we have here are Bast. You can definitely play this deck without Bast, though I do think if you have them, it is a nice upgrade to power. But if you don't, you can just put another 1-drop in this slot and you're probably okay. We do have Carnage to free up our board a little bit, because sometimes things get a little bit too full, as well as Mojo to take advantage of the more filled locations. Other than that, it's your pretty standard Zoo deck. Since we do replace our cards a lot, since the stones almost all cycle themselves, We do have a Devil Dinosaur in this list because sometimes the Dino is just a good play, as it can be hard for us to hand vomit all our cards out, and obviously Dinosaur does benefit from our hand getting refilled via the new location. So if you have Thanos Zoo, a really solid way to go for this, and I think might just be the best deck choice overall if you have access to the cards. And last but not least, we have Thanos Lockjaw. So this deck still has a lot of the benefits of our other Thanos Zoo deck. However, there's a lot more high roll potential with this one, as we have ways of cheating out a lot of big cards very effectively with our stones, and we can still use the stones to fill up that lane and get a copy of our hand if it's a nice bonus, or just denying the opponent of doing it. If you're really dead set on trying to fill it up the most times as possible, I think the Zoo version's probably better, but I think this one might be the deck that is stronger over all games, including those without seeing the new location. So take that for what you will, but I've been very impressed with this deck. This is probably my favorite version of it. Though if you are looking to make some changes, I do think Leech is probably the biggest tech spot. I like Leech right now. There's a lot of stuff it can hit. You do have to be a little careful about opposing Infinauts, but I've also seen Arrow and Vision in this spot, so if those seem a bit more appealing to the meta you're running into, those could be good swaps. Other than that, I think this list is pretty much rock solid. There's really nothing I would change about it. I think it's super good, and because of the stones and some of our other cheap cost cards here, such as Quinjet, Sunspot, Armor, etc., it should be pretty easy to use the new location, and it's just a good deck overall for when the location doesn't show up. So those are our decks here. A little bit less variety in Pool 3 and above this time, mainly because I just don't think there are a ton of decks that utilize this effect super well. It doesn't really fit into a lot of game plans outside of the Zoo and the Dino stuff. But on the other side of that coin, this one should be a bit more accessible, because I think the Pool 1 and Pool 2, specifically the Pool 2 Zoo deck, can really probably hold its own with this location against some of the more powerful Pool 3 and above decks. I think there's a lot of potential there. We'll see shortly. By the time this goes out, the location should be live, so should be some fun trying it out. But that's pretty much going to wrap it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, remember to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.